All right, U.S. history students, here we are. This is the last lesson of new material for the school year. Can you believe that? I'm wearing black because we are not together. We are in our respective homes. What is this about? I'm wearing black because this lesson is kind of a bummer. It's unfortunate that we're finishing on the ultimate bummer of the Vietnam War, but it's how this worked out. And maybe it's just appropriate in a year like this, like we shouldn't finish in too festive a mood. Let's just sort of finish on a somber tone. So let's jump in. Lesson 9.8 about the Vietnam War. And our targets for today, I can explain the misadventure of the Vietnam War. And I kept working on the wording here, and maybe this is the wrong wording. I'm open to that. I want us to be able to explain it, meaning I don't want us to just be able to identify it as a mistake, because I'm going to tell you right now, it doesn't work, it is a mistake, right? I can explain it, and a misadventure is this sense of like, we went off to do something and it just did not work the way we wanted it to, with disastrous consequences. I can feel the weight of the war's costs. Now this is not as grave as World War II, but there are some real costs, and they might not be the ones that you're thinking of right off the bat. This war really started long before we were involved, right? In a certain sense, this whole misbegotten adventure that ends up being a massive drain and a massive source of difficulty and contention and controversy begins as a Vietnamese story of people resisting imperial control, not American imperial control, right? But they were fighting back against a whole series of imperial conquerors, right? So the French had controlled Southeast Asia, these places as a colony. Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia and places like this. This had been French colonial territory. Then in the 1930s and during World War II, the Japanese had come in, and now the Japanese are kind of a different sort of imperial occupier. And then at the end of World War II, when Japan is defeated, France, believe it or not, tries to sort of come back in and regain control of these places. And at that point, the Vietnamese are really pushing back against this, and led by this person named Ho Chi Minh, who is a communist leader in northern Vietnam, who is supported by the Chinese. They managed to sort of make life difficult enough for the French, where the French say, "Okay, fine, forget it," and they leave. And the situation that the French leave behind is a situation where the northern half of the country of Vietnam is controlled by the communist forces of Ho Chi Minh, and the southern half of Vietnam is controlled by a different dictator, but I suppose an anti-communist dictator, a non-communist dictator. And so, stepping back into, let's put our Cold War lens back on, right? So North Vietnam is then an ally of China, and to a somewhat lesser extent to Russia. North Vietnam is communist. South Vietnam, it ain't Santa Claus down there. Ngo Dinh Diem, who's the dictator, is not really a great dude, but he's anti-communist and he's resisting the forces of communism. So the United States is saying, well, it's in our interest that they are supported. And then North Vietnam invades South Vietnam, and this is sort of sounding like the Korean War, right? I mean, this is kind of paralleling that so far. And the United States is seeking to help South Vietnam resist the invasion of North Vietnam with some special forces troops, like not like regular U.S. Army, but some money and weapons and special forces troops. And at a certain point, the United States decides that the dictator of South Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem, is not a reliable or good partner, and he's completely corrupt, and the South Vietnamese people don't even really like him. And the decision is made by President Kennedy to remove him from power, and he's actually assassinated. And when that happens in 1963, when the United States says, we need to get this guy Diem out of power and put a better government in place there to help us kind of resist the North Vietnamese invasion of the South, at that point, it's like you walk into a store and you break it, you bought it, right? You just broke a piece of merchandise. Well, guess what? You bought it. United States, you just removed the South Vietnamese dictator from power, and so guess what? That's your problem now. And so this whole conflict and its escalation is kind of a tale of two wars, right? I mean, it's one conflict, but if you look at the two different sides, they would have two different stories of what this conflict is, right? The United States is just doing the Truman Doctrine, right? Containment theory. We are supporting countries that are trying to resist the spread of communism, right? Because communism is bad and communist revolutions beget more communist revolutions. And if you let the cockroaches into South Vietnam, then they're going to go to Cambodia and Laos next, and it's going to keep spreading and spreading, right? That's what we're doing. That's all the same thing we have been doing, the same thing that happened last decade in the 50s in Korea. Now you ask people in North Vietnam, you ask Ho Chi Minh, you ask some people in South Vietnam, what is this conflict here? Like fighting against sort of American forces? They'd say, well, the United States is just the latest in a long line of imperial conquerors, outside entities that are here, and we want to control ourselves, right? And so we're playing the long game. I mean, they're here for 5 years or 3 years. They want to get this done quick, but the thing is, we've been fighting this war for a long time, so we're going to just wait them out. We're going to frustrate them. We're going to just make it difficult for them. We wait them out, and we will beat them like we beat the French the first time, and the Japanese, and then the French the second time. All right? So get in line, Americans. The same story's coming for you. And on some level, the United States simply did not understand what war the Vietnamese were fighting. We're talking about Cold War stuff, and they're talking about resisting colonizing occupation. And we're saying, well, we're not here to colonize you. And they're saying, well, that's not what it looks like to us, right? And so it's a tale of two wars, a tale of two stories. And this happens in stages, right? There's these early stages that start in the late Eisenhower and the Kennedy years where we're helping South Vietnam, and we're trying to prop them up, and we're sending in advisors like special Marines to sort of train South Vietnamese troops. And then at a certain point we say, look, the South Vietnamese, you guys are not doing a good enough job. Out of the way, let the Americans take care of this, and we'll start fighting the North Vietnamese forces ourselves. We'll fight the forces of communism ourselves. We do this for 3-4 years, and after a while we're just like, good grief, this is not working quickly. This is difficult and frustrating, and at a certain point we start to say, well, okay, South Vietnam, how about we hand this back to you? And we try to hand it back to them, and the South Vietnamese are not able to successfully resist the North Vietnamese until you finally have the conclusion of this war in 1975, when North Vietnam completely controls and conquers South Vietnam, and Vietnam becomes one unified communist country. At every stage, the American moves seem to actually make things worse, right? I'm often reminded of one of my favorite clips from The Simpsons. Check this out.
Dad, you're sinking!
Huh?
Get a rope, Bart!
No, that's okay. I'm pretty sure I can struggle my way out. First, I'll just reach in and pull my legs out. Now I'll pull my arms out with my face.
So a number of presidents have bear some responsibility, but certainly none more than Lyndon Johnson. It's during Lyndon Johnson's presidency, early in his presidency, that this thing happens that America uses as an excuse, as its reason for entering the war on a full-scale level, right? And this is referred to as the Gulf of Tonkin incident. And the Gulf of Tonkin incident is it's a nothing burger, as we might say. All right, it's one American ship. I think it's a destroyer. It's called the USS Maddox. It's not really that big. And in 1964, on like November 2nd, I forgot the exact date, but it has this engagement with a couple North Vietnamese torpedo boats in the Gulf of Tonkin, outside of North Vietnam, and a couple torpedo boats that are not like full-on threats to us, to this American ship. There's some interaction, and we shoot at them, all right? And then 2 days later, there's another report that like, hey, we shot at someone and they shot at us. What we know now is that Lyndon Johnson knew, and higher-ups in the United States Army and Navy knew that like this was not a legitimate threat, right? This was like some people shooting at each other in passing. However, this gets presented to Congress and to the American people as the United States is under attack by the forces of communism. North Vietnamese are being aggressive and assertive, and what Lyndon Johnson's doing here is he's saying, I need some reason to be able to get in here and get the South Vietnamese out of the way and let us Americans deal with this thing ourselves. Let us get in here and win the war. They go to Congress and say, we have been attacked, and Congress responds with this Gulf of Tonkin resolution, in which they basically write a blank check and say, Lyndon Johnson, do what you got to do. President Johnson, do what you must to repel the aggression, to prevent further aggression from the forces of communism. And Lyndon Johnson will proceed to dramatically escalate the war in hopes of, stopping the spread of communism and seeing a quick victory. It cannot be said that the Americans didn't win the war because we didn't provide enough soldiers in this. Like there's a massive amount of soldiers, right? This was still a limited war. Certainly we were not going to use nuclear weapons, and there's a number of ways in which the United States is trying to tread lightly. We're not trying to do total war in South Vietnam. We're partners with South Vietnam, so we don't want to hurt their government or hurt their people or all this stuff. And so we're trying to tread lightly, but with 500,000 troops trying to push back the enemy. Now, part of the trick is that this war is extremely complex and multi-sided. Here we are. We're on one side, right? We're the forces of not quite democracy, because South Vietnam wasn't a democracy, but we're the forces of anti-communism anyway, right? So here we are, and with us is the South Vietnamese army. Now, I want you to imagine an unreliable partner in the South Vietnamese army. It's like being in a group project where you say, look, fine, I'll just do it myself. And the Americans like, we'll do it ourselves, and maybe we'll give you a little bit to help with, but that's it. Who are we fighting against? One group we're fighting against is the North Vietnamese army, right? The NVA. Now, frankly, the NVA, who fights using conventional fighting tactics, is an enemy that we can beat, and the Americans do beat repeatedly. So that's not really the problem. The problem is not when we fight soldiers who are wearing North Vietnamese uniforms. The problem is the guerrilla fighters, all right? The Viet Cong. The Viet Cong are insurgent communist fighters who are not part of any regular army, all right? I mean, the sort of demeaning term is they are the guys in the black pajamas. All right, my father-in-law, who's a veteran of the Vietnam War, talks about this, like the guys in the black pajamas or the guys wearing the pajamas and sandals. They're people who look like average, everyday South Vietnamese people, right? You're walking through a village and you see people, and it's like, these are South Vietnamese farmers or peasants. Or maybe they're Viet Cong pretending to be South Vietnamese peasants. I don't know. Right? I just don't know, right? And that's the nature of a guerrilla or an insurgent fighter. They don't fight using conventional tactics. What do they do instead? Well, they put mines and booby traps and improvised explosive devices, right? And they try to make life miserable for a conventional army like the United States, all right? And then when you try to fight them out in the open, they just disappear, right? They disappear and they scatter. They scatter into underground tunnels like you see here, or they scatter and disappear into the local population. And the local population might like and welcome these insurgent fighters, this Viet Cong, and see them as freedom fighters. The local population might not like the Viet Cong. But frankly, if the local population does not like the Viet Cong, the local population, what can they do? They can maybe alert the Americans that these people here are Viet Cong, but maybe they also say, you know what, I'm worried that the Americans are going to be gone in 3 years and the Viet Cong will still be here. And if that happens, then the Viet Cong will come back for revenge. And so the local population fears the Viet Cong as much as they fear anything else. It's extremely complicated and frustrating. Ho Chi Minh said it pretty well himself. You will kill 10 of our men and we will kill 1 of yours. And in the end, it will be you who tires of it. What we're looking at here is a complex conflict where one of the central complexity is just, where is the enemy? Who is the enemy when I can't tell who that enemy is, right? Who am I supposed to get? If you just tell us, the army, if you just tell us who the bad guys are, point them out, we're going to go beat them. And the United States did again and again when they're in sort of conventional combat. The problem is this war did not go along those terms. The United States Army kept, releasing this information to the public where they'd say, this many American soldiers have died, but that many Viet Cong and NVA have died. Like, we are killing, it's like a 3-to-1 ratio, all right? And so things are proceeding well. But the fact of the matter is, like, that was that was not ending the insurgency. Or the Americans would sort of like clear out, nail down an area and say this is free of Viet Cong, and so this has been sort of reestablished for the South Vietnamese side, and then you turn your back and you leave and you go someplace else for a couple weeks and you come back, and again it's just like infested with Viet Cong guerrillas. Are we winning battles? Yes, we're winning every battle, as a matter of fact. Are we getting close to ultimate victory in the war? I don't think we are, right? Actually, if you take a look at it, it's sort of like the tables turned from the American Revolution. Now we're in the role of the British, who have we're winning plenty of battles, but we've got the wrong overall strategy, or the war is just not being played by the rules we would prefer it to be played by. Support for the war among the American population, which had once been very high, saying, all right, this is our duty, this is our role in the world, we combat communism, it just sort of drops off a cliff at a certain point. The sense that the government keeps telling us that the victory is right around the corner, we're almost there, and then it's like, it doesn't happen. And it doesn't happen, and then we're going to do it for another year, and now we're sending even more troops. And I'm starting to get the sense that either the government is lying to us, or people in the government don't know what they're doing. And you see this meter here, like Americans' trust in government drops in the 1960s, never really to fully return. And in part, that's driven largely by the Vietnam War. It's also driven in part by the war on poverty. We're going to fix this, we're going to go at this, and we're going to sort of do this great society stuff, and then it's like, well, that didn't really fully work. And so a lot of Americans just like, we can't, I used to say that American government could do anything we set our minds to, and now it's like, forget it, I don't think we can do that. Young people in America in that time, certainly young people who had not lived through the hottest early days of the Cold War and the trauma of World War II, were saying increasingly, what are we doing in places like Vietnam? What are we doing here? I don't even agree with the Truman Doctrine or containment theory. Just leave them alone. If they want to be communists, let them be communists. And as a result of all this, by the way, like American servicemen who came home from the war were not treated to the same kind of rapturous homecoming that soldiers in World War II received. They were more or less ignored. I know in talking to my own father, I asked him once, like, because my dad did not get sent to Vietnam, you may recall. And I said, was that ever awkward when people would ask you, like, where you were sent to or where you served, and you said you didn't have to go to Vietnam? And he's like, nobody asked. Nobody wanted to talk about it. That was just it. You just kind of got ignored, and you got the signal, like, people don't want to talk about this thing, so you just don't talk about it. So it was just sort of like people just looked the other way instead. So you have the sense of this country generationally being pulled apart a little bit, the more sort of patriotic older generation saying we got to do the right thing, and like this is our role in the world even if it's hard, and more Americans are saying this is not worth it, or what are we doing here, or just who even reject the notion that that should be America's role in the world. And it just seems like the country's being pulled apart at the seams. And you can see the weight on Lyndon Johnson there in the top picture, famous picture after a briefing where he gets more bad news about the Vietnam War. He could have run for another term as president. He chose not to in 1968, in part because the Democratic Party was torn apart by the war, and younger Democrats did not want anything to do with him, and so he says, look, I'll just step out of the way. By the early 1970s, this war is toxic, and Americans want out. And finally, at a certain point, the United States, like I said, hands the keys off to South Vietnam and says, okay, your problem now, and South Vietnam proceeds to quickly fall to the communist north, and we officially lose the war in 1975. So let's step back at the end here. What are the costs of this conflict? Costs of the war. Costs are significant. 58,000 Americans killed, young men killed in their prime. To compare that, the Iraq War, the Afghanistan wars in recent years that are somewhat similar are much, much, much less deadly. We're looking at a death toll that is lower than 10,000 for those. And so this is a long war, and it's a deadly war. It's a slog. Millions of Vietnamese killed, primarily at the hands of North Vietnam. Let's sort of like make that be plain. But also like they're caught in a crossfire between the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong and the Americans. An immense amount of money spent. $780 billion were spent on the war at the same time as all that spending is ramping up for the Great Society programs. And so the government is spending money as never before, and we've never really fully recovered from that spending spree. In fact, it's sort of our spending deficits continue to widen. A huge cost is just a drop in morale, a drop in and a drop in trust in government in general. A decreased trust that government could do what it said, and a decreased trust that government is telling the truth, right? There's sort of this skepticism or the cynicism that really gets pretty baked into American culture that I wouldn't believe those people, right? Yeah, they're lying to you. And I'd say the fallout as a result of North Vietnam winning the war was not small. In Southeast Asia, the fallout was terrible, right? It was true, like Cambodia fell to communism next. And the communist regime in Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge, put in place a genocide against their own people, the classes of people who were property owners or who had resisted communism. There's all kinds of people who had helped the United States in those days. The Hmong people were basically hill people in South Vietnam and Cambodia who fought alongside the United States, who were not welcome in those countries anymore afterwards, and who did not have a home country of their own, and so many of them became refugees to the United States. And you may know some Hmong people in your own community or neighborhood today. I've taught Hmong students before, and so that's a people who sort of fled to the United States in the wake of the war because they no longer had a home. This is a hard story to finish with, but it certainly works to apply our lens, our story of the blessing and the curse here. What were the blessings that went sour that walked us into this war face first? What was the most tragic aspect of the story to you? What were the biggest mistakes that were made? Can you recognize the key mistakes? Can we understand why they were made? Would we be bold enough to confront and stand up to them if we saw them again? This is where I'll leave us. I won't lie, I'm feeling sad that this is how it's going to end. We have some review coming up. That's fun. This is not how I'd prefer it to end, though, guys. So anyway, that's the end of our instruction. It's been a heck of a year. And you have a heck of an inheritance that you're receiving, despite the misadventure and the tragedy of the Vietnam War. So I'll leave us there, as sad as it is to say. God bless you guys. We'll talk soon in review mode. Looking forward to that. Take care.